Looking back now, walking away from Chloe was the hardest decision I ever made. And honestly, it was the best. It felt like escaping a future I would have regretted forever, a future filled with debt, resentment, and a constant feeling of never being quite enough. But to understand why I say that, why I had to leave the woman I thought was my soulmate, we have to go back to where the cracks first started to show. See, I grew up in Harmony Creek, a small town where people didn't flash their money around. Your word meant something. Nobody thought twice about driving a 10-year-old truck if it still ran fine. My parents taught me to save, to live within my means, and to never go into debt for things I didn't absolutely need. I worked in IT, made decent money, had a nice chunk saved up, and I was content. I owned my small house outright. No car payments, no credit card debt. Nothing hanging over my head. Some folks might call it boring, but for me, that was freedom. Then I met Chloe. It was at a party my friend Liam threw one summer evening. She walked in wearing this stunning dress, all confidence and style, completely out of place in Liam's backyard where everyone else was in jeans and t-shirts. She was from Metropolis, worked in marketing, and she had this electric energy that just pulled you in. We got to talking, and she told me she was tired of the rat race, exhausted from keeping up appearances. And then she said my calm, grounded approach to life was refreshing. She actually used that word, *refreshing*, like I was some cool drink on a hot day. We started dating, and for those first few months, everything felt perfect. She'd drive out to Harmony Creek on weekends. We'd have coffee on my porch in the mornings, go fishing at the lake, cook dinner together, just enjoying the quiet. She even laughed at herself when she couldn't bait a hook properly. She'd say she loved how different my world was from hers, kept telling me how lucky she felt to have found someone who wasn't obsessed with status. I remember one night, sitting under the stars, she looked at me with these soft eyes and said she finally felt like she could breathe. That was the moment I fell completely for her. The moment I truly believed I'd found someone who understood me. But then, little things started happening. Small comments here and there that I brushed off. She'd joke about my truck being older than some of her friends' kids. Make little remarks about how we should upgrade to a nicer restaurant instead of the local diner. Or mention how her friends back in Metropolis had these amazing apartments with skyline views. At first, I thought she was just making conversation, harmlessly comparing our lives. But the frequency started to increase. She'd scroll through social media, showing me engagement rings her friends got, huge diamonds that cost more than my truck. And she'd laugh, saying something like, "Can you imagine spending that much on a ring?" But there was always this look in her eyes, this tiny flicker of want that I tried to ignore. She started talking about her old life more often, the fancy dinners, the weekend getaways, the designer clothes she used to buy without thinking twice. She'd always follow it up with, "But I don't miss any of that," which, in hindsight, should have been my first real clue that maybe she did miss it, maybe more than she wanted to admit. About 8 months in, I decided I wanted to marry her. I'd been saving my whole adult life, and I had enough to buy a beautiful sapphire engagement ring, her favorite gemstone, set in white gold with small accent stones. It wasn't a massive diamond, but it was elegant, unique, and I thought it represented us perfectly. I proposed to her on that same porch where we'd spent so many quiet mornings. At sunrise. Coffee getting cold beside us because we were too caught up in the moment. She said yes. She cried happy tears. And for that first week, everything felt like a dream come true. Then came the moment that should have made me pause, made me really think. We drove to her parents' house the following weekend so I could officially ask for their blessing, and so she could show off the ring. The whole drive, she seemed nervous, fidgeting with the ring box, checking her makeup more than usual, barely talking. When we arrived, her mom opened the door with a huge smile, pulled Chloe into a hug, and immediately grabbed her hand to see the ring. I watched her mom's face change in real time. Watched the smile falter, just slightly. Watched her eyes flick to mine with this look I couldn't quite read. Her dad was more subtle. Gave me a firm handshake, said congratulations. But I could feel the judgment in the air. Her mom made some comment about sapphires being interesting choices with way too much enthusiasm, the kind of tone people use when they're trying really hard to be polite about something they don't actually like. Chloe barely showed the ring to anyone else that day. Kept her hand in her lap during dinner. Didn't post any photos like I thought she would. The drive home was quiet. Uncomfortably quiet. And when I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said she was tired. But I saw the way she looked at that ring when she thought I wasn't watching. The way she twisted it around her finger like she was trying to imagine it being something else. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for weeks. Was she embarrassed of what I gave her? Was the woman who said she loved my simple life actually just waiting for me to become someone different? Someone who could give her the life she'd left behind? Here's what I should have recognized back then, but didn't want to see: when someone tells you they've left behind a lifestyle, watch how they talk about it. Chloe never said she disagreed with materialism or that she'd learned it was empty. She just said she was tired. That's not the same as changed. Tired means you want a break, not that you've fundamentally shifted your values. And when her mom made that comment about the ring being an interesting choice, that wasn't about the sapphire at all. That was about me not meeting their financial expectations. I was being evaluated like a business investment, and I'd already failed the first assessment. The question I should have asked myself right then was this: if she's embarrassed to show her family what I gave her, how is she going to feel showing her friends? Her coworkers? The rest of her world? But I didn't ask that question, because I was in love. And love has a way of making you ignore the obvious until it's too late. Have you ever stayed in a relationship where you knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite admit it to yourself yet? The foundation was already cracked before the proposal even happened. When someone consistently compares your life unfavorably to their past, they're telling you exactly what they still want, and it's not what you're offering. The wedding planning started innocently enough. Or at least, that's what I told myself when Chloe suggested we make a guest list. I was thinking, maybe 50 people, close family and friends, something intimate where we could actually talk to everyone. She pulled out her laptop and started typing names. And I watched that list grow from 50 to 75 to 100. And she just kept going. When I asked why we needed so many people, she looked at me like I'd asked why we needed oxygen and said it would be rude not to invite her entire extended family, all her work colleagues, her college friends, and obviously everyone from her parents' social circle. I did the math in my head, and suddenly this intimate celebration I'd imagined turned into something that felt more like a corporate event. She started talking about venues, showing me pictures of vineyards and historic mansions and waterfront properties that required a year-long waiting list just to book. Every single option came with a price tag that made my stomach turn. But whenever I brought up the cost, she'd wave it off and say we'd figure it out. That weddings were expensive for everyone, that this was normal. I suggested something simpler, maybe the community center where Liam's sister had her wedding, or an outdoor ceremony at the lake. But Chloe's face would cloud over, and she'd get this tight smile that told me I'd said the wrong thing. She started using phrases like "our special day" and "once in a lifetime" whenever I questioned a cost, like those magic words justified any amount of spending. The catering became our first real fight. I found a great local caterer who did buffet-style service. Really good food, reasonable prices, excellent reviews. Chloe looked at the proposal for maybe 30 seconds before pushing it aside and pulling up websites for premium catering companies that did plated meals with multiple courses and wine pairings. The difference in cost was staggering. We were talking about tripling our food budget. But she insisted that buffets looked cheap and tacky, that her family would judge us, that we couldn't ask people to stand in line at our own wedding. I tried to explain that most of our guests wouldn't care, that they'd be happy just to celebrate with us. But she'd already moved on to talking about hiring a live band instead of a DJ. Every conversation about the wedding turned into a negotiation where I was apparently being unreasonable for wanting to stay within a budget, and she was just trying to make sure we didn't embarrass ourselves. I started dreading these planning sessions. Started feeling this knot in my chest every time she said we needed to talk about wedding stuff, because I knew it meant another conversation about spending money we didn't have on things that didn't matter to me. Then one night, I couldn't sleep. I grabbed her laptop to check my email because my phone was charging. The browser was still open to her last search. I saw the tabs. She'd been Googling how to upgrade an engagement ring, looking at diamond replacements, scrolling through before and after photos of rings that had been fixed with bigger center stones. I just sat there in the dark, staring at that screen, feeling something break inside my chest. She'd never said a word to me about being unhappy with the ring. Never mentioned wanting something different. But here was the evidence that she'd been thinking about it, probably since the day I proposed. I closed the laptop and lay back down. I couldn't stop thinking about all the times she'd angled her hand away when taking photos, all the times she'd kept it in her pocket during family gatherings. All the little signs I'd missed, or chosen to ignore. That was the moment I realized she'd never really been happy with what I offered. She'd just been waiting for me to figure out I needed to offer more. The bridesmaid situation pushed things even further. Chloe wanted her sister, Sarah, and 3 friends from college in the wedding party. Seemed fine, until she announced they'd all need to buy matching dresses from a specific boutique. These weren't regular dresses you could find on sale. These were custom-ordered gowns that cost several hundred each, plus alterations, plus the shoes she'd picked out to match. Sarah called me one afternoon, her voice tight with stress. She told me she was having trouble affording everything Chloe wanted. She had 2 kids, a mortgage, a tight budget, and she'd already tried talking to Chloe about finding more affordable options. But Chloe had shut her down completely, told her she was being unsupportive. Sarah was calling me hoping maybe I could get through to Chloe in a way she couldn't, that maybe Chloe would listen to her future husband. When I brought it up that evening, Chloe's response made my blood run cold. She said if people couldn't afford to be in her wedding, maybe they weren't the right people to have standing beside her. That real friends would find a way to make it work. That this was her one chance to have everything perfect, and she wasn't going to compromise because other people had financial problems. I stared at the woman sitting across from me, and genuinely didn't recognize her anymore. This wasn't the person who'd sat on my porch and talked about how exhausting it was to keep up with everyone's expectations. This was someone who was now creating those exact same expectations for everyone around her. The breaking point came when she started talking about her bachelorette party. Her friends wanted a weekend in Scottsdale, Arizona. Clubs and beaches and bottle service. And they were expecting all the bridesmaids to chip in for Chloe's expenses on top of their own. We were talking about flights, hotels, party packages, the kind of weekend that would cost each person well over $1,000. Sarah called me again, practically in tears this time, saying she couldn't afford it. But Chloe was making her feel guilty for even hesitating, posting things in the bridesmaid group chat about how this was supposed to be a celebration of sisterhood, and she was hurt that not everyone was as excited as she was. I finally sat Chloe down and told her we needed to have a serious conversation about money. About expectations. About what we could actually afford versus what she wanted. That's when she brought up the loan. She'd already researched it, already looked into wedding loans, calculated how much we could borrow based on my income. And she presented it to me like it was the obvious solution to all our problems. She said everyone took out loans for their weddings. That we'd pay it back over time, that the monthly payments wouldn't be that bad if we just adjusted our lifestyle a little bit. I felt like the walls were closing in, like I was being backed into a corner with no way out. I told her no. Told her I wouldn't start our marriage buried in debt for one day. Wouldn't sacrifice our future for a party. That's when she called me cheap. Said I was selfish and small-minded. Asked me if I even loved her, because if I did, I'd want to give her the wedding she deserved. She said I was embarrassing her in front of her family, that everyone could see I wasn't willing to provide for her, that maybe she'd made a mistake. Thinking I was the kind of man who could make her happy. Those words hung in the air between us, and I realized this wasn't about a wedding anymore. This was about who we fundamentally were as people, and we were not the same. Let me break down what was really happening here, because this is where the manipulation reached its peak. Chloe had spent months slowly escalating her demands, testing my boundaries, seeing how far she could push. Every time I agreed to something bigger or more expensive, it reset her baseline for what was acceptable. The guest list grew because I didn't fight hard enough when it hit 100. The venue got more elaborate because I'd already compromised on the catering. The bridesmaid dresses became non-negotiable because I'd let everything else slide. This is how unhealthy financial patterns work in relationships. It's not one big demand. It's 1,000 small concessions that add up to you losing yourself completely. And that accusation that I didn't love her enough? That's the nuclear option of emotional manipulation. She was weaponizing my feelings for her, trying to make me prove my love by destroying my financial stability. The cruelest part was that she'd specifically sought out someone with my values, someone stable and debt-free, because that made me a good provider. But now those same values were being reframed as character flaws. When love becomes conditional on spending, it was never really love. A few days later, she told me her parents wanted to have us over for dinner. Said it was just a casual family meal, nothing formal, but I knew better. I could feel it in my gut that this wasn't going to be casual anything. I showed up to that dinner knowing exactly what was coming. But nothing really prepares you for sitting at a table while 3 people tag team you about your financial decisions. Chloe's dad started it off smooth, talking about how weddings were investments in your future, how the connections you made and the impression you left could open doors down the road. How successful people understood that sometimes you had to spend money to show people you were worth knowing. Her mom jumped in with stories about weddings she'd attended, how the modest ones were always remembered as the sad ones, how nobody forgot a beautiful celebration, but everyone forgot a cheap one. Chloe sat there quiet, letting them do the work, occasionally nodding like they were making excellent points she'd never thought of before. They had charts. Actual printed charts showing average wedding costs in our region, payment plans for loans, even contact information for a loan officer her dad apparently played golf with. I felt like I was in a business presentation about my own life, except the product they were selling was debt and disappointment. Her dad looked me straight in the eye and said I needed to think about what kind of man I wanted to be. Whether I was the kind who stepped up for his family or the kind who let them down when it mattered. That's when something shifted inside me. When I realized this wasn't about love or commitment or building a life together. This was about control and keeping up appearances and funding a fantasy that had nothing to do with me. I set down my fork, looked at Chloe, and waited for her to say something. To defend me. To tell her parents that we'd figure this out together as a couple. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Just kept staring at her plate like the pattern on the china was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. So, I said it. Said the thing I'd been holding back for weeks because I kept hoping we'd find our way back to those quiet mornings on the porch. I told them I wouldn't sacrifice my future for one day. That I'd worked too hard to build a stable life to throw it away on a party. That if Chloe needed me to go into debt to prove I loved her, then maybe we wanted different things out of this marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence where you can hear people's brains recalculating everything they thought they knew. Chloe's face went red, then white, and she finally looked at me with eyes full of anger instead of love. Her dad started to say something about me being unreasonable, but I was already standing up, already thanking them for dinner, already walking toward the door. Chloe followed me outside, and we stood in her parents' driveway under the porch light while moths circled above us. And she told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I told her I was pretty sure marrying someone who valued a wedding more than a marriage was the bigger mistake. And then I got in my truck and drove away. The next few weeks were brutal in ways I didn't expect. Chloe told everyone who would listen that I was cheap and controlling, that I'd promised her a beautiful wedding and then backed out when it came time to actually pay for it. That she'd wasted 2 years of her life on someone who didn't value her. Her version of events spread through her social circle like wildfire. And suddenly, I was getting messages from people I barely knew, telling me what a terrible person I was. Liam told me to ignore it. Said anyone who actually knew me would see through it. But it still stunned to have my name dragged through the mud by someone who'd told me she loved me just weeks before. I threw myself into work, started going to the gym more, spent time with friends who didn't ask me every 5 minutes if I was okay. And then, about a month after our breakup, I heard through Sarah that Chloe had started dating someone new, a lawyer named Marcus, who apparently had money and wasn't afraid to spend it. Part of me felt relieved that she'd moved on so quickly, that maybe now the drama would finally die down and I could start rebuilding my life in peace. But Chloe being Chloe, moving on quietly wasn't really her style. She posted photos constantly, designer bags and fancy restaurants and weekend trips to places like Santorini, Greece. Always with captions about finally being treated the way she deserved. Marcus seemed nice enough from what I could see. Always smiling in photos. Always dressed sharp. The kind of guy who looked like he walked out of a cologne advertisement. I stopped checking her social media after a while because it felt like watching a performance that had nothing to do with real life. But I'd still hear updates from mutual friends who couldn't help themselves from filling me in. Apparently, Chloe was already talking about wedding plans again, already looking at venues and showing off a new engagement ring that made her sapphire look like a toy from a vending machine. Friends told me she was pushing Marcus even harder than she'd pushed me. That every conversation was about the wedding, about what she wanted, about making sure everything was absolutely perfect this time. I almost felt bad for the guy, almost wanted to warn him. But I figured he was a lawyer and probably smart enough to figure it out on his own. Then one Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after I'd walked away, I ran into Olivia at the grocery store. She'd been one of Chloe's bridesmaids, and we'd always gotten along fine during the planning phase. She looked genuinely happy to see me, which was surprising given how Chloe had been talking about me, and she suggested we grab coffee. We sat down at a cafe, and she told me she'd felt terrible about how everything went down, that she'd never really believed Chloe's version of events, and honestly, she just needed to vent to someone who'd understand what Chloe was really like. Olivia told me everything. Told me things I never would have known otherwise. Chloe had pushed Marcus to book the most expensive venue in the entire region. Insisted on a guest list even bigger than the one she'd wanted with me. Demanded a ring upgrade just months after he proposed because the first one wasn't quite right. The bridesmaids were all stressed about costs again. Chloe had picked even more expensive dresses this time, and the bachelorette party was now planned for Santorini, Greece. But here's the thing that made my coffee taste better than it had any right to. Marcus had started asking questions. Started pushing back. Started realizing that maybe this wedding wasn't about building a life together, but about putting on a show. 2 weeks before they were supposed to send out invitations, he called the whole thing off. Told Chloe he couldn't marry someone who cared more about the wedding than the marriage and ended their relationship entirely. Olivia said Chloe was devastated. Not because she'd lost Marcus, but because she'd lost the wedding. Lost the chance to prove to everyone that she could have the perfect day she'd always wanted. I wish I could say I felt nothing when I heard that. That I was completely over it and didn't care what happened to her anymore. But the truth is, I felt vindicated. Felt like the universe had confirmed what I'd known all along, that I'd made the right choice walking away when I did. A few months later, I made a decision I'd been thinking about for a while. I sold my small house and put a down payment on a bigger place. A real house with land and a view and room to grow. The kind of property I'd always dreamed about but never bought because I was saving for a future that turned out to be an illusion. I started dating again eventually. Nothing serious at first. Just coffee and conversations with people who didn't measure my worth by my willingness to go into debt. Life got quieter, simpler, better in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or proving anything to anyone. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that moment on her parents' driveway. About walking away from someone I thought I'd spend my life with. And I'd feel grateful instead of sad. Here's what I learned from all of this, and I hope it helps someone else who might be in a similar situation. Love shouldn't come with a price tag. And the person who truly wants to build a life with you will care more about the life you're building than the party you throw to announce it. When someone shows you who they really are, especially when it comes to money and values, believe them the first time. Those little comments Chloe made about my truck, about my house, about wanting better restaurants, those weren't jokes or harmless observations. Those were her real feelings leaking out before she'd perfected the act. And when someone uses love as leverage to get what they want, when they tell you that proving your love requires you to damage yourself financially or emotionally, that's not love at all. That's control wearing a romantic disguise. I didn't lose a fiancé that night in her parents' driveway. I escaped a future I would have regretted forever. I escaped years of debt, years of feeling like I was never enough. Years of watching my hard-earned savings disappear into someone else's fantasy while my own dreams collected dust. The wedding she wanted would have lasted one day, but the debt would have lasted years, and the resentment would have lasted even longer. Sometimes the best decision you can make is the one that disappoints everyone else but saves yourself. What would you do if someone you loved asked you to compromise everything you'd worked for?